Welcome everyone to the first lecture of the HNRCA's Monday Seminar Series Fall Semester. My name is Sarah Booth and I welcome you from the HNRCA. We have made the decision this year to continue our series exclusively on Zoom, at least through this semester. I call it the democratization of science. Through these Zoom seminar series hosted by the HNRCA at Tufts University, we have been able to share the line of outstanding speakers to a very, very broad community. Our scientists, our staff, our trainees, and beyond the boundaries of the HNRCA across the country. We feel that this is a wonderful opportunity to share such an excellent lineup of speakers in the area of nutrition and aging. We wouldn't expect people to be coming to the HNRCA on a weekly basis, hence we're going to keep it at Zoom at least for this fall semester. So each Monday, we feature a leading researcher in the fields of aging. This fall, from today through December 13th, we will focus on speakers with expertise on aging. I hope you can join us each Monday at noon Eastern Time. If you can't make it each Monday, we will be posting each of our lectures on our website. Today, we are featuring two of the HNRCA's own investigators who will be sharing some really exciting new research on how our energy requirements change as we age. Our first speaker will be Dr. Susan Roberts, a senior scientist and the lead of our energy metabolism team. Dr. Roberts did her PhD at the University of Cambridge in the UK, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship with the late Vernon Young, who developed the structure for developing the majority of our current dietary reference intakes. Since joining the HNRCA, Dr. Roberts has conducted some of the most novel work on energy requirements and obesity within the nutrition field. Indeed, some of her work comparing energy requirements between younger and older adults are still unique and seminal to this day. She has received many awards that recognize her research, including the prestigious W.O. Atwater Lecture Award, which recognizes a scientist for making a uniquely important contribution towards improving the health of people around the world. Dr. Roberts has received continuous extramural federal funding since the early 1990s, and indeed was recently awarded an NIH grant to examine a novel food-based approach for preventing age-associated cognitive decline in older adults with obesity. We will also hear today from Dr. Sai Das, who is a scientist one with the energy metabolism team. Dr. Das earned her PhD from Tufts University, and her primary research areas include the impact of dietary energy restriction on metabolic aging in humans. Dr. Das was a very key individual in the landmark Calorie trial, and I am so proud to announce that just a few weeks ago, Dr. Das received a new NIH R01 for a follow-up multi-site project on the calorie that will study the legacy effects of calorie restriction on health span and aging. So it is with great pride that I present Drs. Roberts and Das to present today's lecture titled, "How do energy requirements change during aging and implications for eating a healthy diet?" I encourage you to use the question and answer option at the bottom of your screen for any questions you have for speakers. All questions and all comments will be addressed at the end of the lecture. So without further ado, I would like to turn the podium over to Dr. Roberts to start the seminar for the series. Thank you very much, Sue. And Sue, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself and perhaps putting your camera on so that everyone can see you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. That was the key missing thing. It was my voice and my face. All right, thank you very much. In fact, I asked you that question and didn't get a reply, and I was wondering why. Sai and I are going to be talking about declining energy requirements and implications for nutritional health in old age. As Sarah said, this is something that we have a long-term passion for. All right, so now, okay, yes. So aging itself is the strongest risk factor for age-related diseases. This is an old slide, in fact, from US statistics, but it shows the just enormous escalation in the risk of things like heart disease, cancer, stroke, pneumonia, diabetes, accidents, kidney disease, and Alzheimer's with aging. Aging is not a benign thing at all. Since that time, I think we've got a refined view of the problems that people experience in older life, and it's actually much broader than just the non-communicable diseases and Alzheimer's. So for chronic diseases, sure, we have diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. We have cognitive decline generally, as well as Alzheimer's and dementia. We have sense organ diseases, age-related macular degeneration, cataracts, and even hearing loss. We have sarcopenia, frailty, osteopenia, and osteoporosis. We have gastrointestinal problems with chronic constipation and urinary incontinence, and then obstructive sleep apnea. There's just so many things that older adults get increasingly as they get older. And down in the bottom of this slide, you will see a horrible statistic that I dug up a little while ago, which is the years spent in disability at the end of life. And there's algorithms for how you calculate years of disability, and that each different disease gets a different weighting and so forth. But the key thing here is that years spent in disability at the end of life have increased from about 5 years in the 1960s to about 10 years currently. And, I've personally found that horrifying, that people in the last 10 years of life have really reduced quality of life, and that's far longer. 5 years I can see fine. We could live with 5 years. 10 years seems like an awful long time. Through the HNRCA, bunch of us, which included many people from the HNRCA, some senior scientists, some junior scientists, starting in 2020, we put together a review of consistent evidence for the association of nutrition parameters with prevention of chronic aging-associated diseases, and that was published earlier this year. And I'm going to show you a few summary slides from that. But really, the evidence was compelling, I would say, based on epidemiological data, not just individual studies, but altogether, we reviewed 175 expert consensus reports, umbrella reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses to generate these findings. But what you see is for musculoskeletal, for cognition, and for gastrointestinal problem, first of all, a healthy BMI pops up as being a very consistent way to prevent and delay these problems. But then secondly, healthy dietary patterns also pop up very consistently for frailty and sarcopenia, for cognitive decline, for dementia. And then there's specific nutrients, fiber in the case of chronic constipation. For all of this list of aging-associated diseases, you can delay or prevent them substantially, if you believe the epidemiological data, by about 10 years, in fact. And I started to color code things so that yellow is for BMI and green is for dietary patterns, so that you could see the patterns. One interesting thing to call out here is that different studies obviously define what they mean by a healthy diet in different ways. Some have a prudent diet, some a Mediterranean diet, some of them are the healthy eating index, which is HEI here. Some have the WHO's healthy diet indicator. We didn't see any consistent evidence between, you know, one dietary pattern, one healthy dietary pattern being markedly superior from another one. And if we go on to the additional list of other aging-related diseases, the sense organ diseases, the non-communicable diseases, and sleep, you see the same thing. Healthy BMI comes up time and time again, and healthy dietary patterns come up time and time again as ways that you can prevent the onset of all of these things which have been considered aging-related things. You know, it's not even clear that we should be talking about them as age-related diseases if really they're related to whether you eat badly and whether you have overweight or obesity. And that's a provocative comment, of course. We also, in the same review, we looked at the whether there was consistent evidence for nutrition parameters for the treatment of common age-related diseases too. And again, we used the consensus reports umbrella on systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And again, for a smaller list, but nevertheless an imposing and long list, weight loss came up time and time again for something that would be substantially effective as a treatment. And that included even things like urinary incontinence. It included things like cognitive decline. Healthy dietary patterns also popped up sometimes. And in addition to that, there were specific nutrients for specific conditions. So for example, preventing, you know, treating osteoporosis, if you like, to slow down the progression with calcium and vitamin D. Type 2 diabetes, weight loss with healthy dietary patterns, and even healthy dietary patterns without weight loss can be useful for diabetes. So there was compelling evidence for an enormous long list of aging-related diseases that could be prevented and also substantially treated with healthy nutrition and weight management. This is a summary of the last 3 slides in which, you know, I was just doing a check mark for can you prevent with all of these things, healthy diet generally, healthy BMI. You can see that the majority of boxes are checked. Can you treat with healthy nutrition and weight loss? And you see about the same number of diseases are beneficially affected by weight loss and beneficially affected by healthy diet. These are such important messages for America, for the world, you know, given how many old people are living these days and the increase in lifespan that's going to make those problems worse. So with that backdrop, I want to talk more specifically about the expertise of our lab, which is how do energy requirements change with aging and impact nutrition? What are older adults eating and factors influencing old age? And then Sai is going to talk about calorie restriction. The first point I want to make is that humans are efficient machines. If we're thinking about energy requirements are just total energy expenditure at weight maintenance. So someone who is not gaining or losing weight, their total energy expenditure is their energy requirement. And these days we measure that with the doubly labeled water method, which is a stable isotope method in which you basically give deuterium and oxygen 18 labeled water, which are non-radioactive. And so you capture your subjects, you bring them into the HNRCA, you dose them with water, And then you get a few urine specimens, not complete 24-hour samples, just a few specimens over the course of 14 days. And you do some diet recalls during that time to find out what they're eating, what the balance of fat, protein, and carbohydrate is eating. And you get a 14-day free living measurement of total energy expenditure. It has transformed our ability to estimate energy requirements. So now, modern men and women do not require that many calories. If you look at the reference here is the Institute of Medicine's latest values. Men require, on average, it's a gross average, but even so, about 2,500 calories a day. Doubly labeled water measurements in subsistence farming communities and in hunter-gatherer communities have found very similar results around the world. And similar things for women. Women require about 2,000 calories, give or take. These are for a reference woman with a healthy BMI and a typical height. So we just don't need that many calories in the first place, and we live just fine on 2,000, 2,500 calories on average. This is a study that we did a while ago, one of our grad students in the lab, who measured the calorie content of restaurant meals in popular ethnic categories. And it was published in JAMA. And these dotted lines show 500 calories is about the typical amount that you would require at a meal if you also had some snacks, 3 meals and snacks. 670 is about the amount that you'd require, if you weren't snacking. But you can see for all of the popular meal choices, and we went to the restaurants blinded and we asked them, that we wanted the most popular choices. Almost all of them were way, way over the typical requirement for a single meal. Some of them on average were up at 2,500, which is the total energy requirement of an average man. So an average of 1,260 calories just for the entree and the free sides, not including drinks, not including desserts, not including appetizers. So, our food environment, if you like, is totally unaligned with the human energy physiology that we and other people share around the world. We also went to measure calorie contents in other countries in the world because we thought, well, maybe this is exclusively an American problem, and it's not. The only place that had actually reasonable portion sizes was China. Every other country had worse values for energy content. And the US, in fact, wasn't even the worst. The worst was Ghana and India, and Finland came up higher than us. So it's a very shocking and very global problem. To come back to doubly labeled water, so how do we get from measurements of energy expenditure to energy requirements? As I mentioned, doubly labeled water is the gold standard method for energy requirements. You get 14-day measurements. We have 2 databases today. One is the old database, which I was a member of the Institute of Medicine Energy Requirement Committee, as Sarah mentioned, and we compiled all of the doubly labeled water in the US to date up to that time. So we still have that database and it's freely available. And just in the last month, there has been a new International Atomic Energy Agency database which compiles doubly labeled water and other measurements available from those studies from global sources, including the US. And it's much larger because it's 20 years later. The weakness of all of these databases, both the Institute of Medicine and the International Atomic Energy Agency's databases, that they're all based on convenience samples. Almost none of these studies were just looking at the energy requirements of people. They were measuring total energy expenditure as part of larger studies. And there's almost no adults over 80 years. There's almost no normative data at all. There's an enormous shortage of data from underrepresented groups in America, for example. And given that this measurement was usually done in the context of larger, more complex studies, we think that the information to date may substantially underestimate the degree to which energy requirements decrease during aging, because we're talking about very self-selected healthy populations who are eligible to enroll in studies. And because people get sicker as they get older, there's going to be more people excluded because they're not healthy in the aging sample. So increasingly unrepresentative, if you like, as people get older. With that qualification in place, this is the calculation of how energy requirements change with age if you use the Institute of Medicine's database from 20 years ago, which is specific to the US. And this is for blue is men, red is women, and the different dots represent a range of activities for sedentary and light individuals of different heights and different BMIs within the healthy range. And you can see that they decline progressively, about 25% decrease in energy requirements between age 20 and 80 years, which is a substantial amount. It's basically a whole meal that you wouldn't eat at 80 compared with 20. And I want to draw your attention to this line, which is at 1,600 calories a day, because that's the lower limit of the current USDA dietary recommendations for Americans. So I've got a foghorn. The example menus that the USDA puts out stop at 1,600 calories for adults. They do have smaller menus, but those are for children. So keep that graph in your mind and contrast it with this one, which is from the latest, which is from the International Atomic Energy Agency data, which was published last term. And you can see that very curiously, it's a really different curve. Beyond, say, 60 years, yes, energy requirements do decrease. That's the same as the Institute of Medicine. But between about the age of 20 and 60, and total energy requirements don't decrease at all. We don't have any answer for this. I would say my suspicion is that because this includes other countries, and because perhaps the studies using doubly labeled water have become increasingly complex with a corresponding, less representative population, that we've just got extraordinarily healthy people during this time, so that, you might say that this, perhaps would go right down like that if we had normative data. But that's pure speculation today. And in the absence of some more studies, I don't think we can really say which database is better. The declining energy requirements with age, well, I should say the non-declining energy requirements with age are reflected in Ponce's basal energy expenditure data too. They don't really see any change in basal metabolic rate here. And then they see this little drop in basal metabolism to about age 80, followed by this very curious rise to age 95. I don't have any better explanation than the one I've just given, especially since this is adjusted for weight and body composition. So these data are independent of weight change. Contrast that with data from our own Dr. Saltzman from the Friedman School, which is something that we published a while ago, in which we showed marked physiological changes in energy regulation with aging. This is from our study of overfeeding and underfeeding and changes in resting energy expenditure, which is a very similar measurement to basal energy expenditure, also called metabolism in the press. But you can see that when young men overeat, a certain percentage of those calories goes to increasing resting energy expenditure. They do gain weight when you overfeed them, but they also blow off some calories too. And when you underfeed them, their metabolism contracts. So they lose weight, but not as much as the deficit in calorie intake. And that relationship is attenuated in old men so that they don't as readily increase their metabolism or decrease their metabolism compared to young men. So it's an example of physiological changes where through, within a single study, we have picked up physiological changes with aging that you don't see here. So I think the field has become much more controversial in the last month, which is always an opportunity for more good research. How we see the pathways to unhealthy aging is that there are a number of ways where people may eat unhealthy food. It can be low income, it can be decreased willpower in an obesogenic environment. It can be low nutrition literacy. We can add to that decreased energy requirements, at least after age 65, even if earlier than that is controversial, and decreased dental health, physical health, and such like. But unhealthy food choices do lead to overeating with inadequate nutrition. And I think if overeating causes obesity, that itself accelerates aging. So it becomes a self-reinforcing problem that people are gaining weight. They are unable to lose weight if they have obesity and have unaccelerated aging too. So it's a difficult and thorny problem to address. I want to talk now about the implications of these changes in energy requirements for general nutrition. And this is a summary of national dietary data and the percentage of people below the estimated average requirement or adequate intake for different nutrients for different age groups. And you can see that the American population in general is horribly unhealthy, that all of these nutrients on the right-hand side are consumed in very inadequate amounts. But the ones with a red star are ones where there are less nutrients consumed in older adults. So there are the nutrients which are more limiting in elderly people. And you see the same thing in dietary patterns. We've got 6 panels for men and women, for young, middle-aged, and older adults. And the message here is that you get an increasingly blue panel on the right-hand side for older adults. Those are the people who are a percentage below the estimated average requirement. And in fact, 50% of people have less than the estimated average requirement of whole grains, dairy, seafood, vegetables, fruit, oils, nuts, seeds, soys, proteins. Just most of the foods that we need are consumed in inadequate amounts by the majority of older adults. And almost nobody eats inadequate amounts of solid fats and added sugars. So Cheryl Gilhooly's team calculated for us what are the implications of low energy requirements in old age. And she took different dietary patterns. We started with the dietary guidelines. We had a Mediterranean diet and we had a vegetarian diet, typical kinds of foods. And she calculated whether you could get recommended servings of fruits, vegetables, proteins, dairies, whole grains, and oils for those 3 diets, starting with 1,600 calories and then getting progressively less. Because as we saw in the Institute of Medicine graph, increasingly as average calorie requirements fall, the number of people who fall below 1,600 calories increases. And you can see at 1,600 calories, it's easy with all of these different dietary patterns to basically meet the kinds of dietary recommendations that will be suitable for health. As calorie requirements decrease, it's increasingly hard to meet all of the recommended amounts. So by the time calorie requirements get down to 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day, you can't eat that little food and make adequate intakes of all of the recommended food groups. So I'm not providing any solutions, if you like. There's different kinds of solutions. I mean, it's possible that, for example, we don't need as much fruit in old age. I very much doubt that, because the body gets sensitive to, for example, inflammation, and you want your antioxidants for that. It's possible we should be routinely recommending supplements for older adults as a way to address micronutrient shortfall. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's useful to identify problems, because once you've identified problems, you can start to think about solutions. I'd like to hand over to Sai now for, we're switching gears slightly to talk about calorie restriction, but it's a very related topic, as you'll hear.
So I'm going to be talking about calorie restriction, like Sue said, and we'll start first with, can you see the slides?
We can, Sai, fantastic.
Great. So calorie restriction, for those who are newer to this concept, is the consumption of fewer calories than one habitually eats without compromising diet quality and sustaining this practice for a long time. So there is nutritional adequacy as an individual is going through negative energy balance or energy restriction. And the goal here is simply to attenuate or slow down biological aging. The goal is not weight loss and not obesity prevention, but to live a longer life that is, healthy and free from disease and disability. So that is the primary goal of calorie restriction. And for us as nutrition scientists, this concept is really exciting simply because it is the only non-pharmacological approach known to reduce the rate of biological aging in many species, including rodents and non-human primates. We are coming up on the 20th anniversary of when the National Institute of Aging embarked on looking at calorie restriction in humans to see if the benefits in humans were similar to that observed in rodents and non-human primates. We're also coming up on almost the 15th year anniversary of the first ever large randomized controlled trial that was conducted, of which the HNRCA was a huge participant. We do have, at the time that we embarked on the human studies, we did have some observational evidence from humans. It was noted that the Okinawans, and Okinawa is an island that's off of the mainland of Japan. The Okinawans were living longer. They were living longer than their Japanese counterparts in the mainland of Japan, but also in comparison to westernized societies where longevity was recorded, which is basically Sweden and USA. So this graph here to the right shows how in red, the Okinawans, or the line that is at the top, is representative of the Okinawans, and they had really good longevity. And the reasons for this longevity was then examined, and the Wilcox brothers and their team showed that indeed these folks were living longer because they were actually restricting their caloric intake anywhere between 15 to 50%. And they attributed much of this longevity in this population to that energy restriction. So there were other, small pockets of observational and incidental studies, such as the studies in the biosphere, that informed us that this could perhaps potentially be investigated in the humans. We also had very strong evidence from the non-human primates, the monkey studies. There were two flagship landmark studies that were published, one at the beginning of when the human randomized controlled trials were initiated, and one at the end. The Wisconsin primate study, which included all of the monkeys that were studied at Wisconsin primate lab, showed that calorie restriction basically attenuated or had a lower rate of age-related mortality, which is shown on the left graph. You can see that the animals, the monkeys here, lived longer compared to the ad libitum control animals. And likewise, in the panel to the left, you will see that the percentage of animal that survived disease-free was also higher in the calorie restricted group, again shown by the line that's on top compared to the ad libitum controls. So this was the Wisconsin primate study, which showed longevity benefits and also showed benefits on health span. And towards the end of when we were completing our human trials, it was there was a publication from the NIH monkeys where it was shown very clearly that perhaps longevity was not so clearly different or markedly different between the control and the CR animals, but health span, or the number of years that one is able to live disease and disability free, was higher in the calorically restricted group in comparison to the control. So the proportion of monkeys without age-related disease was higher, and this was true for all of the typical diseases that are common to humans as primates. So we had strong data from these two studies, and we had the first randomized control trial that was done at the HNRCA as well as at Pennington and WashU. These were the other sites, as noted by Sarah. This was a multi-site trial. And we did study this in healthy individuals. In males, the age range was 21 to 50. For females, it was 21 to 47, simply to rule out any confounding by perimenopausal and other such effects. And note that this was done in normal weight to slightly overweight participants. So the BMI range was largely in the healthy range. Participants were randomized in a 2-to-1 ratio in favor of caloric restriction with, for every person that was randomized to the control group, there were 2 randomized to the calorically restricted group, and randomization was stratified by site because this is a multi-site trial, as well as the biological sex and BMI status, which is 22 to 25 and 25 to 28. So that's basically the design. It was in individuals without obesity and healthy individuals aged 21 to 50. So the trial did show that although in the beginning we were on target, close to 20 to 25% with caloric restriction for the first 6 months, over the 2-year period, they leveled off at 12%. And this is somewhat interpreted as a failure of CR, but it's not really a failure of caloric restriction, but our ability to be able to counsel folks to stay on track for adherence on a day-to-day basis. We used a mathematical model, which was derived from a short-term data, and over the 2-year period, that model was not sufficiently informed and implemented to be able to get people to comply to a 25% CR. And notice that this was in non-obese individuals, and so at the 2-year mark, they're also smaller individuals, and the calorie restriction wasn't titrated. But basically, at that 12% caloric restriction over the 2-year period, there was a very robust weight loss, which is very indicative of negative energy balance, around 8 kilos that was sustained over the 2-year period. And what I want to point out is the body composition. Now we're looking at the 2-year period, the relative composition of fat-free mass and fat mass. So the calorie restricted individuals actually had a better body composition, or more favorable is the better word to use, more favorable body composition with higher fat-free mass, 72% versus 28%, compared to the ad libitum control group, which did on average have a lower fat-free mass and a higher fat mass. And this composition in favor of higher fat-free and lower fat mass was true for males, calorically restricted males versus the ad libitum control males, and then also for the females. So essentially, the body composition ratio was in favor of a higher fat-free mass and lower fat mass at the end of the calorically restricted period. One thing we did note was the ratio of loss in terms of relative components of fat-free mass. There was a higher loss of lean mass in the males compared to the females, and with a 3 kilogram loss that largely consisted of appendicular and trunk lean mass. And while this was not considered hugely concerning or detrimental, we don't want this kind of a loss for older adults where there might be serious implications with regards to functional quality of life, as well as overall health span related effects. And so this observation I'm showing here because of the implications that it may have with older adults. Nevertheless, in this younger adult age group, we did find system-wide benefits, especially with regards to inflammatory markers. We had total WBC and lymphocyte counts, ICAM and leptin. All of that was improved greatly in response to 2 years of caloric restriction at that 12%. Serum CRP and TNF-alpha concentrations were about 40 and 50% lower in the CR group in comparison to the control group. And these findings were pretty remarkable with regards to its impact on other system effects. We did not have huge decreases in regards to the, or improvements in regards to the immune system, although there were no detrimental effects, of course, no change in IGF-1. The binding protein 1 did, of course, get significantly improved, and the ratio therefore decreased, but we did not have any delayed type hypersensitivity skin response or antibody titer, and no infection rates that were higher or different from that of the control group. So in this slide, I want to point out that we had very strong improvements in inflammatory markers. We also had marked reduction in oxidative stress parameters as indicated by isoprostane levels, and all of the sub-components were very markedly decreased, meaning that oxidative stress was reduced in response to caloric restriction. We also looked at biomarkers of aging. This was done using samples from the biorepository. Again, biomarkers of aging are variables that are designed to measure the rate of aging, and they can often predict lifespan as well as health span. And they can indicate the functional sort of capacity of an individual or a group of individuals, and therefore they're very useful in assessing the effectiveness of aging interventions. So what has now sort of developed or emerged in this area is that there are a number of sophisticated measures of markers of aging and measures of aging, but the index we use, which is a mathematical index composed of individual biomarkers of aging, was thought to be, more accurate than chronological age. And this biological age measure, called the Clamaro-Duval method, was used. And the markers that we put into this composite aging index are shown here. They're regular metabolites that you would measure. And using this marker of biological aging, it was shown that the calorie restricted group, which is in blue here, showed a delay or a slowing in the rate of biological aging over the 2-year period in comparison to the ad libitum control group, where aging was accelerated with time over that same period. So this was really useful, and multiple measures have now been sort of tested as well, and this finding has been replicated. It's very clear that not only at the cellular level for oxidative stress and inflammatory markers, but also overall biological aging was attenuated. Now, when we have all of these lower level or cellular changes, we also want to make sure that there is no impact that is detrimental or negative to quality of life. And Calorie indeed showed that there were no eating disorders, depression, or other psychiatric conditions that were resulting from this 2 years of caloric restriction. There was also no negative effect on any quality of life or cognitive function related parameters. And in fact, there were some improvements in general health, mood, reduction in tension, and improved sleep quality and quantity, as well as improved sexual drive in relationships. So this is of great importance when you have a lifestyle intervention. Quality of life and maintaining that is really key, especially in the context of older adults and how we age with time. So in terms of safety and tolerability, which was one of the most important things that we wanted to measure in this intervention, given that it was the first ever in humans, was that there were similar proportions of adverse events in both calorically restricted and ad libitum control group. There was a transient anemia in some cases, which was, of course, returned to normal. And this transient status was then rectified within the scope of the intervention, and folks were returned to CR. There was also some reduction in bone density, which was expected for the amount of weight that was lost. And however, it underscores that, when CR is undertaken, especially in older adults, that it needs to be monitored very carefully and cannot be something that is done without such medical and clinical supervision. And in some, there were no significant adverse effects in the CR group compared to the control group with depression, verbal memory, and other things that were just recently mentioned. So I want to summarize for this whole talk by saying that nutrition and healthy weight management can have substantial effect in delaying the onset of age-related diseases and conditions. It's so exciting to know that we have this capacity to be able to improve the aging process and attenuate it by actually making nutritional and lifestyle interventions possible for the aging process, and in some cases can also use it to treat diagnosis. And because energy requirements fall with age, it can be hard to attain adequate nutrition after the age of 60, and elimination of unhealthy foods is beneficial for nutritional status. So regardless of whether it's CR or just health-related changes that are happening for the diet, we really have to ensure that adequate nutrition is always achieved, and so this has real important implications for how these lifestyle changes are incorporated. Research to date indicates that calorie restriction with adequate nutrition appears to be safe and slows markers of biological aging. However, and I want to really underscore this, it remains to be tested in older adults. We do not know at this time if this is safe for older adults, and work is underway at the National Institute of Aging to study this and to do these types of trials, but right now we're not ready and we're not there. And since currently physicians do not screen for diet and physical activity in older adults, implementing routine screening with referral for unhealthy test results could achieve substantial benefits for healthy aging. And this is sort of the theme that clearly has been emphasized in that manuscript that was collectively done with team science from the HNRCA. So I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to discussing.
Thank you, Sai. I'm Roger Fielding from the HNRCA, and I'm just going to moderate the question and answer section. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A box in Zoom. So the first question goes to Sai. For the CR studies, did you also adjust for PA levels, physical activity levels of participants?
Yes, in the analysis we did, and it's specific to the analyses, but if you're talking about the calorie restriction prescription, they were actually derived from objective measures of energy requirements.
Thank you. And did habitual physical activity levels change with caloric restriction? Is there data on that?
Yes, it's not very much sort of, I think, widely published or written up, but there was a small decrease in physical activity energy expenditure in the calorie restricted group in response to 2 years of calorie restriction intervention. And this is sort of published as compensatory responses, overall compensatory response to CR, yeah.
Thank you. So this question is to Sue. With aging, there can be an enormous decrease in the number of foods a 75-year-old can eat due to acid reflux, food intolerance, etc. How does one take that into consideration to get complete nutrition of all the required nutrients?
It's a great question, and I don't know the answer. I mean, I think that it almost feels like we've been caught flat-footed, I think, that, we've all been kind of studying aging, but all of a sudden, there's this enormous population of elderly people, and it's increasing and it's increasing. And, we just don't have good nutrition recommendations, really. I mean, I know people like John Mason would say, and also Rob Russell would say, supplements should be an important part of the diet of older adults, because there's specific nutrients. So it's just really hard to get, taking into account things like this. But we don't have national recommendations on things like that. And I think it's, it's probably really time to start reviewing, are the nutritional requirements of older adults the same, not just everyone 60 and above or everyone 70, but break them down into age groups. and then from there work out how do you meet those. If supplements are essential, what supplements are they, how should they be taken, etc. We can do a good job, but first of all, you have to recognize these things as a problem. And I think your question is very relevant.
So there's another related question for Sue. There's a certain incidence of malnutrition, including negative energy intake, deficiency of macro and micronutrients among elderly populations in the USA. Do you think you should recommend increased consumption of energy-dense foods, butter, cheese, eggs, fatty fish, nuts, with dietary supplementation as a guideline for these older people?
It's possible. The calorie limitation is a really major limitation. I mean, it's possible that the focus on low energy dense foods for weight management in younger life can optimally shift to higher energy dense foods later, but that needs to be combined with getting everything, including the bioactives that are not currently viewed to be essential. So I don't know whether that's the right solution, but I think that should be on the table as one of the things that we start to think about when we address these issues in a more rigorous way than's been done in the past. And so it's a good thought.
I mean, just thinking about this in a very simple way, is more physical activity going to facilitate an ability to consume a higher energy intake? I mean, is it that simple in a way?
Sure. I mean, well, it's partly, I think encouraging older adults to be as active as they can has to be part of the solution, because if you can do 200 calories a day of activity, that's 200 more calories of foods with nutrients in them. But we know that metabolism forms, even the Ponce data says that metabolism falls. And we know that VO2 max falls, so that, there's a ceiling on activity. So I think it can be an important part of the solution without obviously being the whole solution.
This question is for Sai. I'll take my prerogative to ask it. So to me, the changes in lean mass with caloric restriction in the calorie trial in men and women were substantial, I think. Is there any indication that stabilizes over time, or can you follow those people to see if they continue to lose lean mass? Because I think if it continued, it certainly is troubling to me.
Yeah, so when I looked at it, within the 2-year period, the change happened initially and then, stabilized. So that leads me to believe that, yes, it is not a favorable change for sure, but it's not a cumulative sort of change that continues to linger. And so, yeah, so it happened mainly when there was weight loss and sort of stabilized in the 2nd year for sure. But I hear you. There was a recent publication that talked about time-restricted feeding and lean losses. So I think looking at body composition to ensure, particularly for the older adults, that there are no, detrimental changes and that these don't persist, and that, if the lifestyle is, kept for more than 2 to 5 years, that there are no changes, particularly in functional quality of life. That's something that needs to be investigated. Yeah.
Great. There is a comment. I lost it. What are some of the factors, Sue, that contribute to the decrease in nutrient intake with aging?
There's so many factors. Poverty, social norms, decreasing calorie requirements, dental health. Somebody mentioned gastrointestinal problems. I think it's not like there's any signature fingerprint of, this always happens to every person as they get older. It's just like a buffet of different things. We also showed, and it's been replicated by many people, that older adults often lose their sensations of hunger. So they get less hungry, and they can skip meals and not realize it because they don't have the same hunger signals as a young person. So that can be an important factor, especially when people get over 70.
Any data on calorie requirements and dietary patterns for weight gain in older individuals that have a low BMI?
I have not seen that. I mean, there may be data. You often get skepticism when people, talk about the difficulties of gaining weight. But I think for someone with a BMI of 18.5 who's lost weight, it probably will be difficult. I mean, you're going to have to flip things and start thinking about high energy dense foods for sure. Probably low fiber foods, take away the things that encourage satiation. But there isn't any systematic work on that I'm aware of.
So Alice Lichtenstein had a comment. Let me just read it, see if you have any comments. Current RDA values for all age groups are made independent of body size, body composition, and level of physical activity. That makes it difficult to use the same criteria for comparisons between older and younger individuals.
Yeah, I think the recommendations that we've got are quite primitive, and that there's lots of ways in which they can be improved, hopefully in the next series.
I wonder too, maybe Sai can comment on this as well, but we think of body weight and BMI as being sort of this finite measure, but it starts someplace and it ends someplace. So I wonder about looking at trajectories of these changes, because someone that's always had a BMI of 20 may be okay if they age and they still have a BMI of 20. But if they gain or lose across that lifespan or period of time, I think it has more impact.
Absolutely, Roger. There's data that very clearly shows for the same body weight and within the same BMI sort of range, within individuals, there is a change in the ratio of fat to fat free, which unfortunately is unfavorable. There's data that shows that over time and with age, that people can have the same BMI or body weight, but there is definitely an unfortunate shift in body composition. So I think that is really important, and that's why there are clear sort of implications for how interventions are addressed for over the age groups. But more work needs to be done, and I really think that optimizing that composition is where the work is. Work needs to be done, and where the work and research really is heading. So I just want to point out though to Alice's comment, Alice, but we do have body weight and level of physical activity that you can choose when these recommendations are or energy requirements are chosen. So there's the very low active, sedentary, very low active, moderately active, and highly active categories of physical activity, and body weight for sure goes in. Body composition would be really ideal to include, but right now we're not there with regards to the energy requirements.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you, Sai and Sue. We're now at the point where we are concluding our seminar for today. I'd like to thank both speakers for outstanding contributions. Their scientific input has been really valuable in this area. And thank you for all for attending and the really excellent questions that we had during the Q&A. Thanks everyone for participating.